The Golden Bane. Chapter 1. The Weight of Sorrow. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered barn siding, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Margaret O'Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the doorway of what had once been her husband's pride and joy. Now, 3 months after Patrick's funeral, the barn stood as empty as her heart. No livestock, no eye whose dust motes dancing in the pale afternoon light. At 52, Margaret felt far older than her years. The lines around her green eyes had deepened with worry, and her once vibrant auburn hair had begun showing streaks of premature gray. Her hands, once soft from a comfortable life as the wife of a successful farmer, were now calloused from the manual labor she'd been forced to undertake since Patrick's passing. The farm that had been in Patrick's family for 3 generations was failing. Without her husband's knowledge of crop rotation and animal husbandry, Margaret had watched helplessly as their modest savings dwindled to nothing. The vegetables in her garden had withered from her inexperienced care, and the few remaining chickens barely laid enough eggs to feed herself, let alone provide income. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the voice behind her, made Margaret turn. Standing at the edge of her property was Harold Blackwood, a thin man in an expensive suit whose presence always made her skin crawl. His pale eyes held no warmth, and his smile never quite reached them. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here today?" Blackwood approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. As the wealthiest landowner in Millbrook County, he had been circling Margaret's property like a vulture ever since Patrick's death. His offers to buy her land had become increasingly frequent and increasingly insulting. "I've been thinking about our previous conversations," he said, removing his hat and smoothing his thinning hair. "I know you've been struggling, and I hate to see a woman in your position suffering unnecessarily." Margaret's jaw tightened. She knew what was coming. "I'm prepared to make you a final offer," Blackwood continued, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. $500 for the entire property. It's more than generous, considering the condition of the land and buildings. $500. Margaret's heart sank. The property had been appraised at nearly $3,000 just 5 years ago, but she knew that Blackwood was taking advantage of her desperate situation. Still, it was more money than she had seen in months. "The land has been in my husband's family for generations," she said quietly. "We can't just—" "Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwood interrupted, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "Let's be realistic. You're a widow with no children, no income, and no prospects. This land is worthless to you. You can't farm it, you can't maintain it, and you certainly can't afford the taxes that are coming due next month." The mention of taxes made Margaret's stomach clench. She had been avoiding thinking about the $200 tax bill that would arrive soon. Without that money, the county would seize the property anyway. "The soil is depleted," Blackwood continued, warming to his theme. "The well is running dry, and the buildings are falling apart. No one else would even consider buying this place. I'm offering you a chance to walk away with something rather than nothing." Margaret looked out over the rolling hills that stretched beyond her property line. To Blackwood it might look worthless, but to her, every acre held memories. The oak tree where Patrick had proposed, the meadow where they had picnicked on summer evenings, the small cemetery plot where Patrick now rested, marked by a simple wooden cross she had carved herself. "I need time to think," she said finally. Blackwood's smile became predatory. "Of course, but don't take too long. My offer won't stand indefinitely, and winter is coming. You'll need money for heating oil, food, basic necessities." He placed the contract on a nearby fence post. "I'll need an answer by the end of the week." As his black automobile disappeared down the dirty road in a cloud of dust, Margaret sank onto the porch steps of her small farmhouse. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like a physical force. She had no family to turn to. She and Patrick had never been blessed with children, and her siblings had moved west years ago. Her few friends in town were struggling with their own problems in these difficult economic times. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of weak tea, staring at Blackwood's contract by lamplight. The legal language was confusing, but the essential message was clear. Sign here and lose everything Patrick's family had built, or refuse and lose it anyway when the taxes came due. She thought about Patrick's grandfather, Sean O'Sullivan, who had bought this land with money saved from working in the copper mines up north. Patrick had told her stories of how Sean had cleared the fields by hand, built the barn with his own 2 hands, and slowly transformed the wilderness into productive farmland. "What would you do, Patrick?" she whispered to the empty room. "How do I choose between impossible and hopeless?" The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was indeed coming. Soon, she would need money for heating oil, warmer clothes, and food to last through the cold months. $500 would be enough to rent a small apartment in town, and perhaps find work as a seamstress or housekeeper. But it would also mean abandoning everything she and Patrick had shared, everything his family had built. It would mean leaving Patrick's grave to the mercy of Harold Blackwood, who would probably plow it under to plant more of his cash crops. Margaret blew out the lamp and made her way to bed, but sleep eluded her. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the old house settling, the creak of floorboards, and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Somewhere in the darkness, she could almost hear Patrick's voice, but she couldn't make out what he was trying to tell her. As dawn broke gray and cold over Millbrook County, Margaret O'Sullivan faced the hardest decision of her life, unaware that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Past. The next morning brought with it a bone-chilling rain that seemed to seep through the very walls of the farmhouse. Margaret woke to the sound of water dripping into a bucket she had placed under a leak in the bedroom ceiling, another repair she couldn't afford to make. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and made her way to the kitchen, where she prepared a meager breakfast of oatmeal and the last of her preserved peaches. As she ate, her eyes kept drifting to Blackwood's contract, still lying on the table where she had left it the night before. The man's words echoed in her mind. Worthless land, no prospects, walk away with something rather than nothing. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps she was being foolish to cling to a dream that had died with Patrick. After breakfast, Margaret decided to take a walk around the property, partly to escape the gloom of the house and partly to say goodbye to the places that had meant so much to her and Patrick. She pulled on her old rain boots and Patrick's heavy coat, which still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, and stepped out into the grey morning. The rain had turned the dirt paths muddy and treacherous, but Margaret knew every inch of this land by heart. She walked first to the small family cemetery, where Patrick rested beside his parents and grandparents. The wooden cross she had made was already showing signs of weathering, and she made a mental note to treat it with oil if she decided to stay. "You don't know what to do, my love," she said aloud, her voice barely audible above the pattering rain. "Everyone says I should sell, that there's nothing here for me anymore, but how can I leave you? How can I let strangers walk over the ground where your dreams are buried?" The wind picked up, bending the bare branches of the old oak tree that stood sentinel over the graves. For a moment, Margaret could have sworn she heard Patrick's voice in the rustling leaves, but when she strained to listen, there was only the sound of rain. From the cemetery, she walked to the barn, her footsteps squelching in the mud. The building that had once housed Patrick's prize cattle and stored hay for the winter now stood empty and forlorn. Rain dripped through holes in the roof, creating puddles on the dirt floor. Margaret remembered how proud Patrick had been of this barn, how he had spent countless hours maintaining it, repairing boards, and ensuring it was weatherproof. As she stood in the doorway, memories flooded back. She could almost see Patrick moving through the space, milking cows in the early morning light, forking eye into the loft, whistling the Irish songs his grandfather had taught him. This barn had been the heart of their operation, and now it was just another reminder of everything they had lost. Margaret was about to turn away when something caught her eye. In the far corner of the barn, partially hidden by shadows and debris, was an old wooden chest she didn't remember seeing before. Curious, she picked her way across the uneven floor, stepping carefully around the puddles and fallen boards. The chest was smaller than she had first thought, about the size of a hope chest, and made of dark wood that had been polished to a deep shine despite years of neglect. The brass ingots were tarnished but still functional, and there was no lock. Margaret hesitated for a moment, wondering if she had the right to open something that clearly belonged to Patrick's family, then reminded herself that she was Patrick's widow and therefore the rightful heir to whatever family heirlooms remained. The lid opened with a soft creak, releasing the scent of old wood in lavender sachets. Inside, Margaret found a collection of items that told the story of the O'Sullivan family's time on this land. There were old photographs, some so faded that the faces were barely recognizable. Letters tied with ribbon, written in a careful hand that spoke of a more formal time. A small leather journal with entries dating back to the 80s. But it was the item at the bottom of the chest that made Margaret's breath catch. Wrapped in oiled cloth was a hand-drawn map of the property, far more detailed than any survey she had ever seen. The map showed not only the boundaries of the land, but also features that were no longer visible, old creek beds that had dried up, the locations of long-demolished outbuildings, and most intriguingly, a series of symbols marked in red ink behind the barn. Margaret lifted the map closer to the lamplight, streaming through the barn door. The symbols looked like small crosses, and beside them, in Sean O'Sullivan's careful handwriting, were the words "Copper Traces, follow the vein." Her heart began to beat faster. Patrick had mentioned that his grandfather had worked in the copper mines before buying the farm, but he had never said anything about finding copper on their own land. Margaret studied the map more carefully, trying to orient herself. If she was reading it correctly, the symbols were located in an area behind the barn that was now overgrown with brambles and small trees. She folded the map carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, then continued exploring the chest. The leather journal proved to be Sean O'Sullivan's diary, chronicling his first years on the farm. Most of the entries dealt with mundane matters, weather, crop yields, the health of his animals. But as Margaret flipped through the pages, certain passages jumped out at her. June 15, 1823. Found most of the green rock behind the barn today. Same as what we used to see in the mines up north. Might be worth investigating when the harvest is done. September 3, 1823, showed the rock samples to Murphy in town. He thinks there might be something there, but says it would take money to dig proper shafts. Money we don't have. October 3, 1883, decided to leave the copper beef for now. The farm is doing well, and there's no need to tear up good land chasing dreams. Maybe someday, when times are harder. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the entries. Sean O'Sullivan had found copper on the property, but had chosen to focus on farming instead. He had marked the locations on his map, but had never authorized the mining opportunity. The knowledge had apparently died with him, never passed down to his son or grandson. She looked up from the journal, her mind racing. Could there really be copper deposits on her land? Could this be the answer to her prayers? The miracle that would allow her to keep the farm and honor Patrick's memory? But even as hope flared in her chest, doubt crept in. Sean's entries were from more than 40 years ago. Even if there had been copper here once, it might be long gone. And even if it wasn't, she had no idea how to mine it, or whether it would be worth the effort. Still, as Margaret carefully replaced the items in the chest and prepared to leave the barn, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. She had 3 more days before Blackwood expected an answer. Perhaps it was time to do a little investigating of her own. The rain was letting up as Margaret made her way back to the house, Sean O'Sullivan's map burning like a secret in her pocket. For the first time since Patrick's death, she felt as though she might have a fighting chance. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Margaret spent the rest of that rainy day poring over Sean O'Sullivan's journal and map, cross-referencing the entries with her knowledge of the current property. By evening, she had identified the approximate location where Sean had found his green rock samples. The area was now heavily overgrown, hidden behind a tangle of blackberry vines and young saplings that had sprouted in the decades since Sean's time. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through Margaret's coat as she made her way to the barn. She had spent a restless night planning her approach, and now, armed with Patrick's old tools and a determination born of desperation, she was ready to investigate Sean's claims. The area behind the barn was even more overgrown than she had remembered. What had once been clear farmland was now a wilderness of thorny vines, fallen logs, and trees that had grown tall enough to block out much of the sunlight. Margaret began by clearing a path with Patrick's machete, cutting through the brambles and dragging away the debris. The work was backbreaking. Margaret's soft hands, already roughened by months of manual labor, were soon bleeding from dozens of small cuts, despite the thick gloves she wore. Her back ached from bending and lifting, and more than once she had to stop to catch her breath. But she pressed on, driven by the faint hope that Sean O'Sullivan's map might hold the key to her salvation. By midday, she had cleared enough space to begin looking for the landbanks Sean had marked on his map. According to his notes, the copper traces were located near a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant's head. Margaret searched the area methodically, comparing the terrain to Sean's careful drawings. It was nearly sunset when she found it. Hidden beneath the decades of accumulated leaves and debris was a weathered granite outcropping that, when viewed from the right angle, did indeed resemble a sleeping face. Margaret's heart raced as she consulted the map again. According to Sean's markings, the copper traces should be located about 20 feet to the east of the rock formation. Margaret marked the spot with a stick and returned to the barn to gather more tools. She found Patrick's old shovel, still sharp and well-maintained, along with a pickaxe that had belonged to his father. As she prepared to begin digging, the enormity of what she was attempting hit her. She was a 52-year-old widow, with no mining experience, trying to find copper deposits that might not even exist, based on the 40-year-old notes of a man she had never met. But what choice did she have? In 2 days, Harold Blackwood would expect an answer to his offer. She could sign Sean's contract and walk away with $500, or she could take this one desperate chance at finding something that might save her home. Margaret began to dig. The first few feet were easy. Loose topsoil mixed with decades of fallen leaves and organic matter. But as she went deeper, the ground became harder, packed clay mixed with stones that rang against her shovel like bells. Her shoulders burned with effort, and blisters formed on her palms despite the glove. Several times she had to stop and rest, leaning on the shovel handle while she caught her breath. As the sun began to set, Margaret had excavated a hole nearly 4 feet deep and 3 feet across. She had found nothing but clay, stones, and the occasional earthworm. Doubt crept into her mind like the gathering darkness. Perhaps Sean had been mistaken. Perhaps the copper had never been there at all. Or perhaps it had been exhausted long ago by natural processes. She was about to give up for the day when her shovel struck something that didn't sound like stone. Margaret knelt in the hole and brushed away the dirt with her hands, revealing a patch of rock that was definitely different from the clay and granite she had been finding. This rock was darker, with a greenish tint that reminded her of the patina on old copper pennies. Her heart pounding, Margaret attacked the area around the green rock with renewed vigor. As she cleared away more dirt, she found that the green coloration extended in a rough line through the soil, like a vein running through the earth. She followed the vein for several feet in each direction, finding more of the distinctive green-tinged rock. By the time full darkness fell, Margaret had uncovered what appeared to be a substantial copper vein running roughly north-south behind the barn. The vein was wider than she had expected, in some places nearly 2 feet across, and seemed to extend well beyond the area she had excavated. Exhausted but exhilarated, Margaret climbed out of the hole and gathered her tools. She needed expert confirmation of what she had found, but in her heart, she already knew. Sean O'Sullivan had been right. There was copper on this land, and from what she could see, there was a lot of it. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with several samples of the green-tinged rock. Examining them by lamplight, she had no way to determine the purity or value of the copper, but the very existence of the vein changed everything. Harold Blackwood's offer of $500 for worthless land suddenly seemed not just insulting but criminal. She thought about Sean O'Sullivan, who had found this same vein 40 years ago but had chosen to focus on farming instead of mining. He had been a young man then, with time to build a life on the land through agriculture. But Margaret was in a different situation. She needed money now, not in 5 or 10 years when crops might finally turn a profit. The question was what to do next. She needed to have the samples assayed to determine their value, but that would require a trip to the county seat and money she didn't have for testing fees. She also needed to research mining laws and regulations and possibly hire a lawyer to protect her interests. Most importantly, she needed to keep her discovery secret till she could secure her legal rights to any minerals on the property. If Harold Blackwood learned about the copper vein, he would undoubtedly find a way to claim it for himself, either through legal maneuvering or by pressuring her to sell before she understood the true value of what she had found. As Margaret prepared for bed, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had found something that could change her life, but she also knew that powerful men like Blackwood would not hesitate to take advantage of a widow's ignorance. The next few days would determine whether her discovery would be her salvation or simply another way for others to exploit her vulnerability. She fell asleep clutching one of the copper samples, dreaming of Patrick and wondering if somehow, from beyond the grave, he had guided her to this moment of possibility. Chapter 4. The Golden Vein. Margaret woke before dawn, her mind immediately focused on the tasks ahead. She had 1 day left before Blackwood expected her answer, and she needed to move quickly to protect her interests. After a hasty breakfast, she hitched up Patrick's old horse, Molly, to the cart and set off for Millbrook, the county seat, carrying her copper samples wrapped carefully in cloth. The 20-mile journey to town gave Margaret time to think and plan. She needed to find someone who could assay her samples without alerting the entire county to her discovery. She also needed legal advice about mineral rights and mining claims. Most importantly, she needed to do all of this without arousing Harold Blackwood's suspicions. Millbrook was a bustling town of nearly 3,000 people, built around the railroad depot that connected the region to the larger cities to the east. Margaret had visited only a few times since Patrick's death, and she felt overwhelmed by the noise and activity of the busy streets. She made her way first to the office of Thomas Hartwell, the only lawyer in On who had a reputation for honesty. Hartwell was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Margaret at ease. When she explained her situation, carefully omitting any mention of copper, he listened with genuine sympathy. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said when she had finished, "I'm familiar with Mr. Blackwood's business practices, and I must say that his offer seems unusually low for property of that size. Have you had the land appraised recently?" "Not since my husband's death," Margaret admitted. "But Mr. Blackwood says the land is worthless because the soil is depleted and the buildings are in poor condition." Hartwell frowned. "Even depleted farmland has value, especially if it's properly located. And from what I know of your property, it has good access to roads and water sources. He would strongly advise you to get an independent appraisal before making any decisions." Margaret nodded, then took a deep breath. Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask you about mineral rights. If someone were to find valuable minerals on their property, what would be their legal position? The lawyer's eyebrows rose slightly. That's an interesting question. In this state, mineral rights typically belong to the property owner, unless they've been specifically sold or leased to someone else. Why do you ask? I'm just trying to understand all my options, Margaret said carefully. Hypothetically, if someone found copper or gold on their land, they would own it. Absolutely, assuming they hold clear title to the property. Of course, extracting and selling minerals requires proper permits and adherence to state regulations, but the owner would have the right to profit from any discoveries. Hartwell leaned forward. Mrs. O'Sullivan, have you found something on your property? Margaret hesitated, then decided to trust him. I may have found copper deposits. I need to have some samples tested, but I want to keep the discovery confidential until I understand what I'm dealing with. Hartwell's expression became serious. That's very wise. If you've indeed found valuable minerals, there are people who would try to take advantage of your situation. I know a reliable assayer in the next county who can test your samples discreetly. I also recommend that we file a formal mining claim to protect your rights. By the end of the day, Margaret had accomplished more than she had dared hope. Hartwell had arranged for her samples to be tested by a trusted assayer, and he had begun the paperwork to establish her legal claim to any minerals on her property. The assayer had promised results within 48 hours, which would give Margaret the information she needed to make an informed decision about Blackwood's offer. The ride home seemed shorter than the morning journey, and Margaret felt a cautious optimism as she unhitched Molly and settled her in the barn for the night. Tomorrow, Harold Blackwood would come for his answer, but now Margaret had options she hadn't possessed that morning. She spent the evening reading Sean O'Sullivan's journal, looking for any additional clues about the extent of the copper deposits. One entry, dated November 1883, caught her attention. The green rock seems to run all the way to the old creek bed. If Murphy is right about the value, there might be enough here to make us rich. But the farm is doing well, and I'd rather be a successful farmer than a failed miner. Margaret smiled at Sean's practical wisdom. He had chosen security over speculation, which had been the right decision for his time. But Margaret was facing a different choice. She could accept certain poverty by selling to Blackwood, or she could gamble on the possibility of wealth through mining. The next morning brought Harold Blackwood's familiar black automobile up the dirt road to Margaret's farmhouse. She watched from her kitchen window as he climbed out of the car, straightening his expensive suit and checking his pocket watch. His confident stride told her that he expected no resets to his offer. Margaret met him on the front porch, wearing her best dress and carrying herself with a dignity that seemed to surprise him. Mrs. O'Sullivan, he said, tipping his hat. I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer? I have indeed, Mr. Blackwood, Margaret replied, and I'm afraid I must decline. Blackwood's smile faltered. I beg your pardon? I said I must decline your offer. I've decided not to sell the property. The man's face darkened. Miss O'Sullivan, I don't think you understand your situation. You have no income, no prospects, and taxes coming due that you cannot possibly pay. My offer is the only thing standing between you and complete destitution. Perhaps, Margaret said calmly, but this land has been in my husband's family for 3 generations. I'm not ready to give up on it just yet. Blackwood stepped closer, his voice taking on a threatening tone. You're making a serious mistake. This land is worthless, and you're a foolish woman if you think otherwise. When you come crawling back to me in a few months, begging me to buy this place, my offer will be considerably lower. That's a risk I'm willing to take, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, then turned and stalked back to his automobile. You'll regret this decision, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Mark my words. As his car disappeared down the road, Margaret sank into a porch chair, her legs suddenly weak. She had just gambled everything on the hope that Sean O'Sullivan's copper vein would prove valuable enough to save her farm. If she was wrong, she would lose everything anyway, and Blackwood's prediction would come true. 2 days later, Thomas Hartwell arrived at Margaret's farm with news that would change her life forever. The assay's report showed that her samples contained not just copper but significant amounts of gold as well. The vein she had discovered was what miners called a bonanza, a rich deposit that could potentially yield thousands of dollars worth of precious metals. Miss O'Sullivan, Hartwell said, his voice filled with excitement, "You're sitting on what could be one of the richest mineral deposits in the state. With proper development, this could make you a very wealthy woman." Margaret listened in stunned silence as Hartwell explained the assayer's findings. The copper content alone was valuable, but the presence of gold transformed her discovery from a modest find into a potential fortune. The lawyer estimated that, properly managed, the mine could generate enough income to not only save her farm, but to make her one of the wealthiest people in the county. That evening, Margaret walked out to Patrick's grave and knelt beside the simple wooden cross. The autumn wind rustled through the oak tree's bare branches, and for a moment she could almost feel her husband's presence. "You guided me to it, didn't you?" she whispered. "Somehow, you made sure I found Sean's map and followed his trail to the copper. You're still taking care of me, even now." As she rose to return to the house, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the mineral wealth that would secure her future, but for the knowledge that love truly was stronger than death. Patrick's love had led her to salvation, and Sean O'Sullivan's careful records had preserved the secret until she needed it most. Within a year, the O'Sullivan mine would be producing gold and copper that made Margaret one of the wealthiest women in the state. She used her fortune not just to restore the farm to its former glory, but to establish a foundation that helped other widows and struggling families in the region. Harold Blackwood's attempts to claim the mineral rights through legal challenges all failed,